Hey, everybody, welcome back to SmarterUmedia, the only place on the interweb that dares to pull a little bit of jet fuel in your brain in 2 minutes. And it's going to feel so good. You're going to want to stick around and hear everything we have to say. Today, we get to talk about the stuff that runs everything. It's money and it's politics. We hear about it, we exist in it, but Rich Crone has helped people win campaigns by being head of large divisions in Comcast, smaller companies. Rich Crone, welcome to Smarter You.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the time and to have a conversation with you.
Well, we do this a lot. We talk about things whether anybody is listening or not, but today they have to listen. Well, I guess they don't. They could click a button. I mean, just don't do it. Don't do it. No, don't do it. But today we get to chat about things that you want to chat about, and we're going to get straight to that. So your 2 minutes, you can see, is already on the chicken timer because today we came prepared, Rich. In 2 minutes, make me a little bit smarter.
Awesome. Well, thank you for the time of having me. And what we're going to cover is a little kind of present, past, and future of political advertising, especially the TV world that I've been in, and then kind of look at kind of the people, the process, and performance. So with that, I wanted to say thanks for the opportunity to talk to you at SmarterUmedia, Texas Tech, and the Anderson Griffin Center for Family Business and Entrepreneurship.
It's Alderson Griffin, but he's had that all of his life, right?
I want to say here in 2025, it used to be they had, off and on years. Now it's just odd even. And we got a lot of political activity with select mayor's races, special elections, ballot initiatives, and some state legislative races. But we'll take a look back at 2024 with the most recent presidential election and go in the Wayback Machine for the first TV political ad was Dwight Eisenhower with I Like Ike. Oh. We'll cover those 60 years. We'll kind of look at what next year looks like into 2026, right in my own battleground of my backyard here in Georgia, of $1 billion being likely spent with that. So before we go further, I'll finish this little intro with 3 points. The people, we had 153 million votes cast last year. 20 million were new voters, and over 50%, exactly, which is how we got connected. Over 50% were early voters. And what do campaigns do to reach that early voting audience? Number 2, each candidate campaign is like an entrepreneurial startup, and that's your sweet spot at your center. And every campaign has to kind of look for funding, get the people to run it. And then lastly, we'll talk about the performance. And you were talking about money and politics. There were $11 billion spent last year, which is a 22% increase from 2020. So 11. If those things kind of get people interested, a little smarter, we can talk further.
Look at you. Look at you with your timing thing. That's fantastic. I can only imagine that it's nice to be in a political discussion without emotion. So we are involved in data, right? The things that you're talking about are really at that level, and that's where we're going to start. So let's start back with the data. $11 billion spent in one election cycle. Does that include local races? That's everything altogether?
Absolutely. You had like 3.1 billion spent on the presidential level, 2.9 spent in down ballot. And in between there was the US Congress and some issues. So really look, so the 3.1 will not be there in 2026, right? But the 2.9 should grow as a down ballot measures of the state house and state senate. So you're looking at that sort of growth and activity that it'll be another record year. And what they call now the midterms, it's really, truly amazing that the pie of politics and money just keeps growing.
Well, we did meet in the pro-democracy space and in what I would consider to be one that's hard to be against. It's become somewhat polarizing, even that pro-democracy can be on one side or the other. But in the space we inhabited with gamers.vote, gamers.vote was a wonderful initiative when you were at Comcast. We did events with Comcast in order to get people who play video games and are not voting to get out there and have a voice, because that's what gamers do. So in that sort of space, the fact that more people vote is a great thing. Do you feel like those people are getting information that is good information as they get ready to do that for the first time?
Great question. There is historical data. There's a lot of data vendors out there in the political community. L2, Aristotle, right here in Atlanta. These are big political data shops, and they're really truly trying to target that no voter. So they have all the data of voting history, but do they have sort of that sort of qualified individual who hasn't voted? And so due to the registration, and if they haven't, how and where do you get them? And I loved what we did with Gamers.vote in 2020. And the event that we did was opposite the first Biden-Trump debate. And
Right.
it wasn't trying to distract, because the people who we were trying to reach weren't going to be watching that debate anyway.
Right.
And I think, and the democracy of expanding sort of that voter base of how and where do campaigns use the data to target them, more importantly, get the message to where they are, not
Right.
like to organically try to create something hard of where they're not. And I think that was sort of the different ways the campaigns are trying to reach voters of where they exactly live and breathe and do and operate their day-to-day life.
Yes, and never easy to get to people, even though we have all of the tools that we have. So I'm going to unpack a little bit just the kind of basic notion that in a democracy, it's probably a good thing to vote. What motivated you and I have talked about the story as I would walk around neighborhoods in elections, knocking on doors with a group that did nothing but just ask if people knew there was an election and knew where to vote, right? So not any kind of, I'm trying to influence you, ask you anything about what those substantive issues or people are. It's just, do you know there's an election and do you know where to vote? I would encounter people in younger demographics, so in their 20s and their 30s specifically, who would over and over again say, oh, I don't vote, with pride. I don't vote. And their contention was that that's the way that they are standing up. They're standing up because the system itself is so broken. I'm not going to be a part of that. I always felt a little heartbreak because it's one of those things that honestly, most of those points of view that those people have are not represented today.
Right. And it is our right and almost responsibility to vote. And how do they have a voice in this democracy process, and is it represented? I will know this. I mean, every dollar counts in a campaign because every vote counts, right? And we've had,
Right.
I'll give you a story of, we were working with a candidate, and I said, just for small talk and an initial meeting, I said, why are you running? And candidly, which was shocking and almost disappointing, she said, I'm not sure why.
Ooh,
And
that's
and
honest.
I was sort of
She
taken
lost.
aback, but
Well, now we know.
but fast forward less than a month later, when that election was here, in a state house race, there was
Yeah.
22,000 votes cast, and she lost by 150. And I
Wow.
just wondered out loud to myself, this, like, would a good why have been
Huh.
helpful for 151 votes? And maybe that didn't help the campaign. And I can see, if the candidates are feeling that way, the voting electorate having sort of that same sort of, concern. So how do we overcome that? How do we get people who are candidates, who are, viable, who are ready to do the work? And then how do we inspire those voters to come out and take action?
The answer is we don't, partly because it's a mess. And I
Yes.
could quote so many, people who have great quotes about democracy, that, it's the worst possible system except for all of the others and the like, because it is not simple, right? And it's not going to be perfect. And I think that's part of what is hard for people to accept, yet it's incredibly important to find a way to accept it, because as you look at other systems that you might be able to be a part of, you don't often want to cash this one in with all of its freedoms of expression and its freedoms in order to go to another one. So that means we got to roll up our sleeves, understand it's going to be mucky, it's going to be dirty, and get going, right?
Yep, absolutely.
And does your vote matter? Yes, it matters. In North Carolina, the entire election a few cycles ago, the entire House of Representatives, and I think it was the House of Representatives, hinged on one vote. One vote would have made a difference because it was literally a tie, and they recounted again and again. It was a tie, and they had to go back to an antiquated statute, get a hat, because that's what it said they had to do.
Wow.
Put the two names in there and draw one out. And the balance of power in that state was contingent on one vote. If one more person had voted either side, that would have determined what would have happened in the state. It matters, not always that dramatically, but that's the way water works. If you put a lot of drops, you get a river. And if you get a river, you get an ocean. And that's what votes are, right?
That is.
So money. Okay, that's where we've done a great job of talking about the stuff that's beneath the stuff, which is, okay, democracy. That's what we're in. That's what we have inherited, the great republic, if we are lucky enough to be able to keep it. Now, the money piece of it is what you've been in the middle of for a long time. And I'm going to not address, we'll get back to the question of, is it a good thing, money, and how it affects politics. You have an expertise in simply how it works. So let's take Georgia, the state of Georgia, which has been quite a place to be in the last number of elections. How does the money affect and the spending, because you're in advertising, how does the money in the race make a difference?
Great question. It does have a great influence, and that confluence of money does directly influence votes. So I'll give you sort of a historical perspective. Like in 2008 was my first political cycle. We had a Senate runoff with Saxby Chambliss running, and there was $3.1 million spent to our market in Atlanta. We were a distant fifth out of the marketplace. And that was probably all in, maybe 20 million as an electorate, just to be able to base that upon what was placed for 2008. So fast forward to 2020, it ended up being like 60 million with the double Senate runoffs. And it was probably actually for the market, it was 404 million to the Atlanta marketplace. So go from 20 million in 08 when there was really not a contested race at all. But then you go into 2020 and over 400 million to the Atlanta market. So I was actually in other, around the Southeast and Tennessee, South Carolina, and seeing where that money came in, because one of the leading agencies here actually had the Biden and Harris group. He said that when there's no contest, there's no money. And without competition, there's not going to be sort of an interest on either side. So that meant that those races became much more competitive and much more interesting. And so Senator John Ossoff won in the 2020 election. In 2017, he was up as a state House representative. A U.S. congressional representative in a special election. That was at that time the largest money placed in a special election for a U.S. Congress race in history. It's been now surpassed because it was so competitive to try to win in that special election. And it was just 6 zip codes in a small district. And that meant like we had over 11 million spent on Comcast, but to the market, probably 35 to 40.
Yeah.
And so really, truly, if that's sort of the nature of the competitive of power of each party trying to do a land grab for a competitive race, that's going to attract that attention. That's going to attract that money. And now they're seeing sort of the evolution, and kind of I mentioned, 1952, I Like Ike. There was 3 chances that you could get on TV, the 3 broadcast networks.
Yep.
I think in the evolution of TV and evolution of political campaigns, you've seen the progression from broadcast to cable. And I was fortunate to be in the boon of where cable grew, and I was selling broadcast to. But now it's to see the power of CTV and streaming to effectively target. That has become much more efficient for campaigns to have every dollar strategically used to go towards a district or just stay within the state boundaries or however. So you're asked, like, what does that money do? I think the more competitive we see, the more money comes in to try to fight for that spot.
It's interesting that you use the expression comes in. Because there have been studies done in a number of states, Maine being one of them, New Hampshire being another one, that you saw particularly Senate races, which of course have an implication for all of the country and the federal power as it stands. And some gigantic percentage of the amount of money that was spent did not come from people inside of the state. So I can't help myself. I'm getting into is it really a great thing that we have gone from what you talked about as, a small millions up to 400 million in, I think what you were talking about is 17-year span. And that is was it 15 in the beginning? Was that the first?
The first one was probably like 15 to 20 for the market
15 up
of
to
Atlanta,
400.
and then up to 400 plus, and 12 years later, right?
So that, yeah. So looking at that, that's why when you use the expression money has come in, when money makes such a difference, as we've discussed, in who wins the race to represent the people in the state, and a lion's share in some of those studies I was talking about was 80+% of the money came from outside of the state. Do we have any wonder why we look in a confounded way like a dog tilting its head looking at our political system?
Well, that's a great question. And does that money sourcing outside of the constituents that are actually the ones voting, how does that, garner? So, like, for example, Senator Warnock won in 2020, and he had probably the most ever of any candidate in history of money coming from all over the country supporting. Yep. And you're asking that question, but then, now I'll give your audience resources, right? So livingroomcandidate.org gives you all the historical perspective of the commercials from 1952 up until last year, the presidential results, the actual campaigns, and the commercials used. And I'm a TV commercial guy, right? So I see that. But opensecrets.org shows where this money is coming from and who's tracking, what contributors. And then the FCC, the public file, it shows where they're placing on the different media outlets. So people can track that money of who's placing. It's just now it's wide open just for individual contributors. And then don't even get me started on the PACs and the IEs that help support these.
I worked for 10 years on an effort called Fix It America, and Fix It America was all about just solving 2 things. It was just, I see, to get you smarter in 2 minutes. I only can do things in 2s. That's apparently what it is. But that was just to work on money and its impact on elections and redistricting, because those 2 things systemically make it harder for our system to work, I think, as many of us would like it to. and made it all the way up to the Senate antechamber. So outside of the Senate Judiciary Committee, meeting with the legal beagles to see if there was a way to move something forward. And it was made clear that essentially there were people in the Senate, and I won't say the name, Mitch McConnell, that would be in the way of doing that because they'd made their career on making sure that politics and our elections were open to whatever money people wanted to put in them. Now, people can disagree about that. I look around, but you again inhabit it, and so you see the competitive races, as you say. If it's going to be competitive, nobody's going to spend if it doesn't matter, right? So they're getting sophisticated. But how many of us do you think actually do what you're talking about? When we're looking at an election, do we go and discern and see on these websites whether where the money's coming from, or am I just affected by it and I push the button?
Oh wow! Am I just pushing a button and to consider the alternatives, the other sort of bigger picture of where that money's coming from? You asked about the competitive nature of races. There was one candidate we listened to last year, and he said of the 435 House races last year, there was less than 10% that were actually competitive or
Yeah.
built in a competitive way. And kind of to your redistricting point, that it was based upon that we're going to divide this puzzle piece up before the games even started, right? Yeah. And he said a lot of voters don't know it, and even some candidates getting into the races don't even know that before, it's already been decided just based upon the population and where those districts are. So how and where that game, and it's just I will say I've enjoyed working with agencies and consultants and candidates for that matter who are playing to win, right? And I have run across, not to say, I have run across folks that are just looking to spend the money. And
Sure.
And are you looking to win or are you looking to spend? And that's this. Yeah. There's a significant sort of tactical or strategic way of how those dollars are being allocated and effectively spent by where your philosophy is or if you're trying to win. So,
but I think you would agree with me that spending makes a difference, meaning yes. it makes a difference as to whether, and you can do it better or not as great, but it will have an effect on whether you win.
I think in the smarter you that we're talking about, the smart money is now what's going to help win rather than just to throw it up against. And so just seeing where the viewership, I'm just talking in the TV perspective,
yeah.
as the evolution from broadcast to cable to streaming, and then now right. to social media, to the online digital video, to, all of the different platforms, X, Instagram, sure. Facebook, and now like YouTube and Google. I mean, that's become like the fifth network is what the campaigns are using for the volume of activity and impressions available on YouTube is seeing a significant sort of slide in allocated monies for recognizing that as a platform of where people are watching. Like we've said before, it go where they are, right? And then right. how do you make an impression to where they are with what you're trying to sell as your candidate? So,
well, I think how much. So let's go into all of those buckets, right?
Okay.
It used to be. When Ike started to do this, there was television, and there, like you said, were three networks, and that's what the options were. Now there is this sort of umbrella. It feels almost like space wars. They're everywhere, all over the place, all of those avenues. How does a campaign come at this, and how do you help them sort of figure out where to apportion their resources?
Great question. Of that 11 billion, still the number one lion's share was like 52% about 5.3 billion spent on broadcast TV. So that is still and will be for probably a good while.
When you say broadcast TV, do you mean the four
correct.
networks,
The
not
four
cable
networks.
included? The four networks.
Just the four networks still are garnering 50% plus in the 11 billion. And that'll probably still be significant. The one that got impacted the most last year was cable. Okay. And that the rise of streaming, I won't say it was the direct relational sort of, they all left, cable to go to streaming. It went elsewhere, but the significant drop in viewership. So for example, it was like probably 13% for CTV in 2020. It now went up to like 21%. And there was really no way to capture it because it doesn't sort of register or being recognized through the FCC yet. But there was $2.3 billion spent on streaming and CTV and only $1.3 billion spent on cable. So number two, cable was significantly, probably 17, 18% that dropped down to like 10 or 11 last year. Radio is still a significant driver. Satellite even has, major money there. And now all the social media and Facebook and Google are garnering their share as well. But to that point, I mean, how do campaigns get to it? So there's still sort of a strategy as they want to lay in their broadcast. Now they're trying to look at these platforms. And I work at a streaming TV platform, and we're one of many that can reach that sort of audience, but everything starts with the data. So it's really going, and I'll give you an analogy of in streaming with the data targeting, you can tell exactly who that person is you're trying to reach. Democratic voters who vote in a primary with other characteristics, and we can hit that targeted person. That being said, I just can't tell you when and where it's going to fire because I can't make that activation of them streaming that program. In the cable and broadcast days, you could tell when and where that ad was going to run. You just couldn't really guarantee who actually saw it. Right. And so that is really, truly where I think it's getting much more targeted and accountable. Right. And where if you're hitting that target audience and that targeted viewer, it's no longer relegated to the old traditional prime time of 8p to 11p. And prime time is whenever they hit your audience, whether that's at 2:00 on a Sunday afternoon, but in much more cost efficient and effective ways in doing that. And so I do see broadcast is still going to be good. I see the rise of CTV. I see sort of YouTube having its place. Like we're going to a conference next week. The number one group that's going to be there is Google. And they weren't even there, 2 years ago. And now there'll be 14 folks there as reaching out to these political ad agencies and consultants. Yeah. So,
well, $11 billion is a nice pot, right? So it begs so many questions beneath that we're not going to talk about because I want to stick on the how it works for a minute, because you immediately, I think we see those numbers and go and we're shocked that $11 billion could be spent on an election. On the other hand, a lot of money is spent on a lot of things. So how large is that number in comparison to ad budgets that go into those networks for other things, just for selling soap?
Great question. That I haven't crisscrossed that one as a sort of comparative. I know that the up and down, I do know political was taking the lion's share of revenue in terms of the number one category in our days at Comcast. It surpassed automotive. So if automotive was the number one, category before, we also had entertainment business. And if you're looking at the percentage now, I think automotive is dipped, which is why it's attracting so much more attention because organizations and media outlets are saying, how do we get a hand on that? Because like we just said, it was a 22% increase of 2020 to 2024, and even the midterms, I think from 20 to 22 was like a 12-13% increase. So let's just say next year there's an additional, let's just say 10%, 15%. That's a $1.5 billion increase to make it 12.5 on a mid-year election, which they progress, another $1.5 million beyond that. There's your 22 lift from 2024 for 2028. And
I want to make sure I heard you right. Are you saying that it had become the largest category annually? So in an election year, a network, whether cable or terrestrial, would, I don't know, are they terrestrial anymore? I don't even know if you can even say that. But are they? That was the number one. That made more money for the network than any other category. All automobiles, which had been the biggest in any other category.
I can only speak for what I knew
what you knew
back in the day then, and that for those election years, that's why it almost became like crack, that these organizations were looking at it as it was automatically coming in. I know the work we were doing in 08 and 10 and 12 and 14 here in Georgia, you couldn't get arrested, basically. And then it became in Florida and California were the hot places then. And soon enough, Georgia will cool off after it relegates or whatever. And where's that next place? So I think, and I should pull this up, like the 7 states there were of the battlegrounds was, that's kind of where, if you're an organization that has different cable outlets did not have sort of, organizations or operations in those or in those battleground states. So they didn't benefit from the boom of all the organizations. And I had friends at other places and they said, we're in Seattle and we're not getting anything comparative to those 7 battleground states. So I'm now fortunate to be here in Georgia, but also like in 2020 or 2018, I think we had the Senate race in South Carolina, which at the time, Lindsey Graham versus Jamie Harrison, over 100 million spent in that race. And I think that's one thing that, as you as a business guy and you're running a business center, you look at a return on your investment in that, did we get our money's worth in investing in these different candidates or causes or whatever, and how and where does that return? And I keep wondering, is there going to be a plateau for political spending? But it just hasn't stopped in the past, 8, 10 years or 3-4 cycles.
Well, I had a interesting conversation with Senator Lugar before he died. And I do, do seances to talk to him still. And with he and his,
that'd be a Smarter You episode. I'd like to see. Right.
He and his chief of staff, who were talking about how it is that McCain-Feingold, the law that was the last time there was some sort of restriction on how money would be spent in elections, that passed in Congress. And essentially, I would use the metaphor like the SALT talks with nuclear weapons. There comes a point where you just feel like you can spend infinitely, I can spend infinitely. It doesn't make any difference for us. And so we ought to talk and do something about it. That essentially was what his suggestion was. He says, you keep the ideas there, you keep it in the drawer, and at some point there will be another time when neither side feels like they have the upper hand. And that is when something can come out and maybe we can make some sort of agreement, which seems so far away these days, but has happened before and could potentially happen again.
Well, I love, like you said, agreement or some sort of civil exchange, right? And I think seeing the creative change, It was funny, like years ago in the first, I think, Clinton Trump campaign, which was nasty as could be.
Yeah.
I actually caught, I don't know why, just that guy checking on a Sunday afternoon, a C-SPAN between Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan. And it was a complete dichotomy of the airwaves of all that I've been a benefit of all the negative advertising and commercials. But to see that exchange and their debate was like a civil discourse and just a civil exchange. And there was none of that, all he said, she said. And it's just an interesting way of where our society has become to accept that. And then the creative, and I have, it's funny because I've had a lot of ads sent my way that I've had to, review.
Yeah.
And while we were probably in good taste, not wanting to air them, they had every right to legally run some of these campaigns and ads. And we never took one down, but there were some that we didn't put up. So, and I think in the streaming and in the digital world, it doesn't have the same restrictions or requirements, but we do have sort of SEC sort of guidelines that we like to follow. So like you say, that creative in that process of where and how those hit the TV airwaves or wherever you're watching, whatever you're watching.
You talk about the civil exchange that we used to witness in debates and that you got to go and see on C-SPAN, hearkening back to those days. Aren't we getting better and better and better at getting a message to you that translates into an action point based on two things: fear and the hope and I'm a part of your tribe button? Are we getting better at that? And doesn't that mean that we have less free will in free elections?
That's a great question. And is it fear, hope, and then which is going to change, right? And who's going to be the agent of change to that end? And I will say, in talking with campaigns and organizations for, all this time, I think the most successful ones find that sort of focal point as they're on message and stay on message. So I've asked a number of campaigns, like, what went wrong? And they said, we didn't have one clear message of hope, right? We didn't articulate that one seminal point, and we were just basically noise of different elements, but they've been a part of, general consultants, media consultants, inside campaign advisors, all this, but they didn't really nail down their one focal point to drive home on a consistent basis to all of the different platforms or all the different people. And I think what you're saying there, if you're able, to put that message of hope, that fear only goes so long, right? But I've just seen the most successful campaigns are the one who got it down to one point, and just that was their focal point, but they had different sort of contributing and tributary sort of elements to get to that one point.
Great message of you can connect to, message of hope. We've seen that win in cycles. I've seen more, and you see if you echo my belief, but I've seen more campaigns won with almost entirely negative messaging.
That's it. It's funny because there's an organization called Ad Impact, and they totally track the positive messages and the negative messages of each campaign. And there's been a significant increase in the negative messages because they do work, because they like you say, they had invoked that fear that if they continue this path and what they're doing, they're going to, it's going to hit their pocketbook. It's going to, can you afford groceries? Can you afford schools in your area? And they invoke that fear message as a negative anti. And I wondered, and I'm sure that there's probably good standing candidates who said, no, we want to keep on track with our campaign and our message but inevitably they get to that. And I really, truly, and I think that the overview, I have of all the different campaigns, there's three things that most of them want to do. They all say they want to connect the voters, right? And how do they connect the voters? Number two, they want to raise funds, and that's kind of back to that startup, because you're running a 60-day or a full year campaign startup, and they need to raise funds, but I haven't met many that don't want to win. The candidate themselves may realize that they have an uphill battle, but that they're either just doing it for the next race, and that they're just knowing they're going to take it on the chin on this race. But most of the candidates we've worked with want to win, and I don't know if many people want to waste money to think that they just don't want to win. So and I like to work with people who want to win. Either side doesn't matter. Because they're more vested and they're more interested, and they want to do the best they can at what they're doing.
Well, I think that is absolutely the case. And when we look at people, you get to meet a lot of candidates who are running. I have met many people who are either in office, have retired from being in office, or aspire someday to be in office. And I will tell you, mostly, I feel like their intentions are really good. They want to do good things that they believe in. Whether you may believe in them or not, they believe it's important and want to be a part of it. And they want to make the world, in their mind, whatever that a better place is, they want to make it more like that place. And I've watched those candidates go into a cycle, and in the election cycle, find themselves being asked the hard question, which is, we can run this ad and it will work. It'll get you closer to winning and being able to do the good things. But it will tear down this other person. And they usually, in my experience, run that commercial.
That you hit it right on the head. And there's, like you say, all in good intentions to start, but then it turns its way in a different. It takes a turn. How about that?
Yeah. Well, that's what works again as we look at that. So when we talk about this, and this is don't talk about anything that makes you uncomfortable. Stop wherever you want to stop, but to ask the question, which is, if we take these suppositions and line them up, which is $11 billion were spent in the last election cycle, we know that a lion's share of that money was spent on things that had to do with negative elements of campaigning. And at the end of that, we wonder why we look at each other with distrust, and look at each other and can't understand why you would imagine to believe this way or that, and why we're scared of each other. Aren't we in the political advertising system training people every election cycle to distrust and dislike each other?
And I 100% agree. I mean, that there are visual images, visual sort of a commentary that is burned into those times of people watching and listening, that, like you say, you can't. And then as soon as the election's over, now can we all be one country? I think it's hard to do that on a on again, off again basis. I agree with you.
Yeah. And this is one of those things, because this we all experience. So now that we have come to understand that not just every presidential race, but now every race that we are aware of, with people asking us about the election, the thing they talk about the most is money. It used to be issues. It used to be the things that you care about, and that still exists. But I get more communications from people who are talking about their running race that have to do with how much the other people have raised and how important it is that we raise. And it is almost without exception. I'm trying to think of the last time I received an email or a mailer or something that did not have a direct request for me to give money.
And I'm talking actually just last week with major consultants here in Georgia and another agency. There's so much more transparency of where that money is,
Yeah.
and as soon as it hits for a campaign, they if their opponent has garnered $1 million in fundraising, then they're looking to A, look at their own fundraising, and B, what are we doing to attract more, right? And so that messaging, like I said, they want to connect the voters, raise funds, and get elected. That sometimes it's all three, and really truly, how do they message that person that they want money? Like you just said, as soon as they find out that their opponent had a fundraiser and that it's coming in, they're putting the grease to the wheels for their database.
Because the great horse race that has become our political system in this wonderful Republican democracy
Right.
is that it's sort of, if you raise, and it doesn't always work this way. We should talk about the exceptions, right? There are people who have come in and with a lot of their own money who have essentially made it look like they were going to buy their election, and that doesn't often work
Right.
because we don't want to we don't want it to be that crass, but it's but we really do. We're okay. We understand this is a great horse race, and if one person raises 100% more money than the other one, we realize that's going to make it hard for the other person to win.
And I will say, in talking with different agencies and organizations, a lot of their victory or a lot of their sort of success stories that they like to share is that they were behind in so much money and they still won, right? And I think to have some sort of an upset, if you will, either an incumbent that had all this money or
Yep.
something, a lot of the people like to share their success, that they were getting outspent, 4-1, and they somehow got the right votes and the different elements to make a victory. And I think that just kind of tells that some of the basics of how in reaching the different audiences and
Yeah.
being efficient with that money. And like we were saying, like and now in days and times, it used to be you could get on, let's say, HGTV, nice cable network, which was one of the top 5 back in the day. And to that end, there's 25 different ways to get to an HGTV impression now. Some through your
Right.
original equipment manufacturer, some through Roku, some through directly through
Right.
HGTV. So there's all these different ways that these candidates and campaigns are getting to that source of inventory to make an impression on those voters. But they're all really trying to hit, there's, I think, 20% of in the middle. So 40% are going to not vote for him. 40% are going to vote for him. And it might even be down to 10% that's in the
Yeah.
middle of the independent voter that has yet to decide. So how do they quantify their budgets to hit that undecided sort of electorate that's going to make their victory? Because they're going to get some within whoever they get. There's not going to get any, but really, truly, that middle 10%.
Well, it's incredibly scientific now, right? There's no one operating in a sophisticated campaign who is not really aware of uh, what the lay of the land is and what sort of things that they can do. And I'm just going to abandon the thought of the world that we wish we had and go back to what you said in your 2-minute open, which just sort of was like, we understand as entrepreneurs, if you're going to run a campaign, you are essentially starting a new business. You have to start from the ground up. You hope you have people involved. Who do you think, and you don't have to give a who, but give an example of the process. How do you do that? If I want to run for office, where do I start?
Great question. I've seen it here in Georgia, and what they'll do is they'll go to the consultants, and there are a select like horse campaign whisperers, if you will, people who are. I'm actually registered political consultant, but I wouldn't garner myself in that campaign just sort of guidance. But just talking with a general consultant, he builds a staff of people that he knows that do media, the people that do polling, people that do the different elements to build out the campaign. Staff, who's going to run the staff. So everything boils down to people, process, and performance. So he says, "Do I trust these people?" And that was the word he used last week. Have I worked with them before? Do I trust them? And when it gets crazy in the process, do we have the right people doing the right things? And so I would say that there's all these different campaign people who want to get involved, either as volunteers or as paid sort of staffers for that particular, like you say, entrepreneurial startup. They all know the end game is election day. So there's a group that comes in that you don't have to tell them the whole rodeo. And I think that there's a whole campaign staff of what they know is where the end game is. So that's a good thing, to find the right people that know the process. The performance is, we're going to work long. We're going to work, over an abundance of hours, all for the chance to get this guy elected. And I think this one consultant shared, it is really truly like, you go to people that you know, and then if you don't know them, can you get sort of validation of who they are and who they've worked with before? And so that's first off, you got to build out the team. Number one. Number two, what's the game? Like, do we have the right candidate? Are we able to be in this game? What are our metrics of things we need to do in order to, like you say, get the money is the number one thing of the game. And then they had some candidates who were either good people, but they couldn't raise money. And then they had bad candidates who get a bunch of money, but they weren't good. They weren't good people.
Right.
And then everybody, I did ask, like, what if your campaign loses? Because no one likes to be on a losing campaign, right?
Sure.
But he goes, that there's work that you're doing that will benefit and how and what you do going forward, right? And if you did everything you could in your responsibilities as either a campaign staffer, a poller, or and the general consultant is basically, what I found is, like, he's the team quarterback or the team leader, and he's going to his sources of either media consultants or fundraising consultants. And so it's really, and I was fascinated to kind of learn this years ago, that they're really just trying to put together a team that's trying to win a game, and it's the ultimate win-lose, whether you get your guy elected.
Yeah. So in that context, you want the right coach, you want the right players, you want the right equipment, you want all of those sorts of things. So in some sort of way, almost what you described to me feels a lot like the kingmakers of our democracy, which is such a weird thing to say out loud. The kingmakers of our democracy are this sort of political consultant class that you use the expression, I'm sure there are women in it 100%. As well, but I'll bet it's dominated still by people, and oftentimes male in the old guard, that it's sort of, you may be a great candidate, you may have great promise to do great things for our country, but if you're going to get nominated, and remember, we always think of the election, but you got to get nominated, which is the election before the election. So if you're going to get nominated and you don't have one of those teams or peoples on your side, that's a tall order and rarely even happens.
And don't forget the ever popular endorsement of another campaign to help. So, for example, here in Georgia in 2018, in the primary, Casey Cagle was the lieutenant governor. Brian Kemp was the secretary of state. Casey Cagle was in the lead significantly, and all of a sudden, President Trump at then time supported Brian Kemp, and he got the juice that helped him win the primary. And then in a crazy sort of race against Stacey Abrams in 2018, he won outright. And 3 months earlier, like you just said, in a campaign, he without that endorsement, and then he and Trump have had their battles, and now I think they're back to being good friendly. But that endorsement of either a Trump, and I think that's a real effect for these primaries of how and what they do to separate, because we have a crowded field next year in Georgia with an open governor seat because Kemp is now no longer able to run. And then the Senate races will be once again everybody coming after John Ossoff. And the Republicans will do everything in their power to throw as much money, whether the right candidate in the primary that comes through that process, how and what that will do for Georgia once again.
I could do this for days. I find it so fascinating that the John Locke and John Stuart Mill, when they sat down and thought of the precepts that were read by the founders that led to a constitution to give us the government that we have, they would never have imagined the conversation you and I just had being anywhere near a part of it. It was not in the field of vision. It was not on the radar. You take whatever the metaphor is, it wasn't there.
Conceptually, visually, anything.
No, and yet it's the whole game now. It's the whole game now.
The game has changed, yes.
Which is really why I always, when we get a chance to talk, and it's just the two of us, I always appreciate the insight, because I walk away feeling as if I understand the world as it is so much better than I did before. And I thank you for being here today to help us get a grasp of part of it. And I feel like you're going to have to come back 5 to 10 more times before we can get to the stuff we need to get to.
Well, I thank you for your kindness, and always enjoy our conversations. And truly, I do. I mean, it was something of interest that I got into sort of in a professional way. And I do see sort of the impact of, like you say, it all started how you and I got connected as Gamers.vote. And that was probably my most enjoyable sort of experience of those 2020 elections, which was crazy. And to that end, just seeing how and what the whole voting process is. And now, like you said, it's now a different game of people, process, and the ultimate victory of trying to get guys elected, or guys or gals, whoever.
Trying to get people would
elected.
Be great for us to get elected. So, we end with, you've given us some beautiful resources along the way. So I don't know if you spent all of the things you wanted to say, but we always want to, in an information-based society, particularly with people like you who have to get good information or you couldn't do your job, what's something that I can help? And even if it's going back to the couple that you gave us again, just so when I'm looking at an election, how can I be a better voter or better person participating in the process?
Great question. I'll give you a new one, ballotpedia.org.
Good one.
It is a great resource of the current races and places, and it'll tell you 2025 elections, everything going on from tomorrow through the rest of the year. So ballotpedia.org is for the now. If you want to see where the money flows, that's opensecrets.org. If you want to just check the public files in your own backyard, wherever the people are in or Texas or beyond, you can go to the publicfiles.fcc.org. And if you really just kind of want to look at the historical commercials and the presidential impact, it's livingroomcandidate.org. And I I stumbled upon that and just seeing, and if you really look at sort of the history, the guy who was the Madison Avenue sort of genius behind M&M Mars and, melts in your mouth, not in your hands. He was the one who did the creative for Dwight Eisenhower. And to that end, that creative sort of element of money and power and politics, there is some sort of, messaging. And back before then, they used to do hour-long programs. And he was the one who said, hey, why don't we do a minute? And less, more cost effective. And they didn't have to have an extended sort of full, hour-long sort of platform. And think about what those changes have been.
He's to blame. That's the guy. Let's go get that guy. Make it a minute. Used to do an hour. Let's give him a minute.
And then they cut it down to 30 seconds, and then soon enough it'll be 6. But no, I appreciate the time, and however, to move it forward, and it's just a fascinating. TV is a powerful medium, and there's money that makes that happen. And to be able to help, these political campaigns, it's just been just sort of crazy to see. And I'm humbled each and every cycle to learn something new, and maybe a different twist of what goes on.
Well, thank you for showing up. We would be remiss if we didn't give one more resource, vote.gov. In 42 states now, you can register to vote very quickly online. So it's no longer the arduous process in those states, at least. So doing that at least gets you armed to be able to head into the democratic process. And we can end simply by encouraging people that no matter how ugly you think it looks, no matter how challenging you think it is, do something. Because the way I met this guy, Rich Crone, whatever your name is, the way I met this guy, Rich Crone, is because we were both doing things, caring about the system, and that's how we found each other through gamers.vote. So thank you, and we will see you next time.